Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Spilo, and we're back for round 2 of the scouting report. Today, we're going to be going over the Dallas field. So, over about 8 hours of streaming, multiple different maps, multiple different matchups: Gladiators, Houston Outlaws, the Boston Uprising, and finishing off with the Washington Justice, or starting off with the Washington Justice. We managed to go through a lot of different maps, a lot of different matchups, and a lot of different compositions to get a good read of what the Dallas field need to execute on better and what I would do to beat them. So going over the specific weaknesses of the players, this isn't really a commentary on the skill of the players so much as what they're currently lacking at, and information that I might find useful either for the Dallas field to use to improve themselves or for teams that are up and coming playing the Dallas field. So starting over on macro. Now, this is a really, really important one. And Dallas had an overall tendency to play aggressively, especially in dive, but they often force this aggression too early, either in poor kill boxes, in other words, in locations where Dallas as a team wasn't able to really follow up. So backline can't see, my DPS don't have really good angles, they can kite out really easily. We saw this a little bit with the Gladiators, but it was especially prevalent in the Dallas field. Or when they didn't quite have their ultimates to force a win condition. In other words, we're 90% on an ultimate or 75% on an ultimate. That's kind of what we're relying on to make this fight competitive, but we're just gonna go in aggressively anyway. Even though if we waited 15 seconds or 10 seconds, this spike of power would be a lot better. And I think we saw that throughout Dallas's thing. And I want to say that as not only a negative thing, but also as a positive thing, because they were a very decisive and very aggressive team consistently on almost every single composition that they played. And while that was a highlight, I think that it is exploitable in the fact that you can bait them very easily to often ult or use cooldowns in locations that aren't very good for them. We saw this a lot in Ilios when they were forcing dives in really bad locations. We saw this in Gibraltar, forcing aggression in awkward locations, getting caught with the pants down, trying to stuff chokes when it made no sense for them to stuff a choke. It made more sense to let them come out, the enemy team to come out for them to punish them. But regardless, if you're going to play Dallas field, baits, fakes, rotates, even using an ultimate to bait them to over ult in response was often something that that could have a theory of working very well against them. But in general, very, very aggressive team, very, very focused on working together as a team. So I think that's one of the good things about the team. When it came to dive, as mentioned above, Dallas tended to play force aggression with or without ultimates in poor locations, not playing aggressive around friendly map control consistently. I'm going to dub this the Dallas special for the rest of this VOD just for the sake of simplicity. So if I say Dallas special, you know, forced, rushed aggression in locations where they didn't really need to. Look shaky versus Talon dive. So I described Talon dive as Winston Diva, Reaper Sombra, Moira Lucio. They didn't look very confident against that composition, which is ironic considering they played it a pretty decent amount. They really struggled to clear Sombra off of off angles. There wasn't a lot of emphasis on clearing her out and getting rid of her, which allowed the enemy Sombra to get a lot of hacks, to get a lot of pressure. It's very important when you're playing up against Talon dive that you're clearing that Sombra as quickly as you possibly can, so then you can hard focus on core with your spam, and they were not doing that consistently. Hanman as well struggled a lot with his bubble and positioning, often ending with him getting picked unnecessarily quite quickly. Dive timing, and this is on all dives, was consistently good, with DPS backline pressure consistently available and present during each pressure cycle from Fearless. So if I see Fearless jumping in, I would bet the farm that both of the DPS are in position to do something, as well as the backline or tanks able to at least going to try to contribute along with it. And that was a big improvement from last week with the Los Angeles Gladiators, where there was almost always a disconnect with timing between the tank line and the DPS. On the flip side, Dallas always synchronized, always on the same page. The timing was always there. As mentioned before, they often pull a Dallas special where, why are we going this aggressive right now? But at least they were always doing it together. So the teamwork aspect of Dallas, especially when they're on dive, was always top notch. They look solid in Sombra Tracer versus Tracer Kree matchup with point pressure / 2v1 on Tracer. I mentioned how I wasn't very impressed with the Los Angeles Gladiators Sombra Tracer versus the McCree Tracer matchup that we sometimes see on maps like Gibraltar. But the Dallas field played theirs very, very well. They were able to leverage the fact that they had 2 mobile heroes versus just the one of the McCree Tracer and try and 2v1 the Tracer, basically abusing that advantage / pressuring point, which caused the McCree Tracer, especially in the Washington Justice match, to have a lot of issues. The other thing that Doha did very well on the Sombra in that matchup is playing corners, good angles, where he could almost outpoke the McCree. And the fact that, yeah, he couldn't quite do as much damage as the McCree, I guess that term would be better, out-pressure the enemy McCree, because he couldn't do as much damage to the enemy McCree, but he was holding really good positions where he could be packed, where he had good cover, and he was getting a lot of value out of his damage and hack threat, right? That's the other thing that Sombra provides that McCree doesn't. And I think that is why they found a lot of value out of the Sombra that a lot of teams were not finding value of in the Kree matchup. So I think they looked very good in that matchup as opposed to some of the other teams that we've looked at. They were playing the Talon dive, the aforementioned Reaper Sombra dive. they did not consistently prioritize grouping and clearing high grounds together, got split too quickly. In other words, when you're playing the Talon dive, because it is a brawl dive hybrid, because you're running it with a Moira Lucio, you can't split up and take too many angles. It's mostly we group together as 4 or 5, and our DPS or Reaper or Sombra can split off and apply pressure from another angle. But that does mean that you have to kind of group together and clear high grounds as a group, almost like you're playing a Reinhardt composition, at least like in other dive compositions, and they were not consistent at doing that. Sometimes they group together and rotate really well, and sometimes they get split. Sometimes they'd force aggression on a high ground that their Moira couldn't possibly follow up on. Sometimes they'd clear the high ground and then drop from the high ground onto point and then lose to the high ground a couple seconds later, when they could have leveraged point from a much safer position and been more patient, fully clearing out the high ground. So the Talon dive, not as good of a compositional execution from them as I would have liked, and that sucks considering it's one of the few comps that they can play without a hit scan player. Next on, moving on to their brawl, significantly weaker than their dive with timing, aggression, and playing quality. And this is the Achilles heel of the Dallas Fuel, was the fact that mechanically, especially without a hit scan player, they weren't always like popping off and just crushing people, but the team play was always there. But when you put them on brawl, that team play wasn't even as big of a strength as it is with dives. That there's nothing really going for them in the brawl matchup, at least right now. That might change with time, but as it is right now, Dallas Fuel's brawl matchup is definitely their weakest point. Because the things that made their dive great, the timing, the aggression, the plan quality, those were not as evident in their brawl execution consistently across the board for whatever reason. Desync with a Mei, Ryan, Doom aggression, that kind of ties into the timing we saw before, but especially the front line, not always on the same page. Doom is ahead of Mei is ahead of Ryan, Ryan's it's all over the place. There's a big desync with the brawl pressure, and it makes that comp not one of their strengths. Struggle to find value specifically out of Doomfist kill boxes. We'll talk more about this in a second, but they were not getting a lot of consistent value out of the Sparkle Doomfist from the numerous different maps and matchups that I saw, with the exception of the Los Angeles Gladiator matchup, but that's a different story. Individually, this is where we go a little bit more in depth, and again, this is watching a decent amount of their POVs from multiple different matchups and multiple different compositions. The structure in this is just a complete train wreck, but we're going to try and deliver it as quickly and as efficiently as possible. Handman on Diva, positioning versus dive, was more frontline centered than angle, so I wasn't super happy with how he was positioning and setting up his Winston and dive compositions. When they were playing Diva with Winston, sometimes he was positioned a little bit too much on the front line, kind of running into the Zaryas, running into the Briggs, which you don't always like to see. His vision wasn't very good on what he needed to matrix. He ironically, which we'll talk about in a second, angled better in Brawl Mirror than he did in the dive. Also, his Diva in the dive / brawl versus the spammier comps, whether these were dive or full spam, was a bit shaky with target / peel priority. In other words, not always prioritizing the right things. Sometimes we've got a hacked BAP in our backline, and we're going to hard chasing an echo all the way across the map. Our Winston is going in on, or we're TPing on as brawl onto an Ana Brig and an Echo, and we're going to be shooting a Reinhardt instead of actually going in and eating nades. So it seemed like when we were playing in the non-brawl versus brawl, Heinemann looked a little lost on Diva. He wasn't always eating the right things or prioritizing the right things at the right time, and I think a lot of that had to do specifically with his positioning. In the Brawl Mirror, I'm going to skip ahead there. In the Brawl Mirror, his positioning was consistently good, off-angling, mid-fight, often playing very aggressively in the backline. Matrix management was often very good. I thought his Diva play overall in the Brawl Mirror was much better than Space's. On Zarya, pretty consistently okay. A little greedy with his positioning sometime with his bubble usage, but overall pretty solid. We didn't see a lot of missed bubbles between he and Fearless. Overall, the communication there seemed to be pretty solid. The one thing that I will say is the Gravitons were consistent Dallas specials, as we talked about here. Very, very aggressive. We can't follow up on that, mate. We can't, like, maybe your Winston can jump in there, but we're not going to be able to get the pressure from our Sombra, from our Tracer. We're not going to be able to get that nade, and that wasn't great. So a lot of grabs ended up in either no follow-up or people having to overcommit to try and follow up and then ended up getting his backline killed. But overall, solid Zarya mechanically. Sparkle, Tracer, unsurprisingly, mechanically shaky, and decision-making positioning were problematic. Was picked a lot unnecessarily, just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. However, he did his best in terms of actually listening to and following up in dive calls, and overall his timing was pretty good. So mechanically, terrible, not great at all. Not terrible, but not great, not at all. An Overwatch League top tier caliber, but he was there at the right time, and I think that prevented them from being bad at dive because of the hustle that he did in terms of listening and setting himself up. But obviously getting an actually good Tracer player or an actual hit scan is a priority for Dallas. Surprisingly, Doomfist, very unimpressive in the Brawl Mirror. I'm unsure if this is just unfamiliarity or a communicational issue or a little bit of nerves, but very poorly timed, uncreative, straightforward engages, feeding often, not angling in when he had mapped to do so, not engaging from high grounds consistently, often missed time with his Ryan and May pressure, ending up in front of Reinhardt, and just fed a lot. So nothing impressive about Sparkle's Doomfist, to be perfectly honest. From the multiple different maps, we saw some on Havana versus Boston. We saw some on versus the LA Gladiators on Anubis. We also saw him on versus the Houston Outlaws and Kings Row. And none of those stood out to me as really good Doomfist play in terms of how he's engaging or who he's or like when he's going in. Consistently pretty poor across the board, which was very surprising to me. Not at all what I expected. So I'm unsure if that's just normal for him or if this is just a bad week or a bad couple of weeks. No idea, but I'm looking to hopefully see some improvements for that across the board. Doha, Echo position, cooldown usage solid Echo. Didn't see any terrible issues with this Echo consistently across the board. Looked good. Sombras were rushed on the EMPs a little bit. So overall, good Sombra with positioning. We talked a little bit about that. Timing also good, but we rushed EMPs often similar to Hanmed's Dallas special Grav, basically kind of forcing EMPs in situations we weren't really there to follow up, or the enemy team isn't really doing anything, right? They're not actively contesting our space, so we don't actually have to force an EMP, which often meant the follow-up wasn't very good. We're not hitting very many people, so something that we wanted to see improved on with this EMP. But as I said, positioning timing consistently solid. Although the weird one was sometimes press W for no reason and got himself picked in or translocator force early. So in other words, he'd be holding a good angle and he's walking into the enemy team, and I don't understand. So very little odd, and that threw off some timing sometimes, but mostly solid Sombra. May was not good. Wasn't terrible, but was relatively unimpressive with walls. Wasn't always matching aggression well with this team. Same kind of issue that we have with Sparkle. So again, I don't know if that's all Doha's fault or if there's a communicational error because both the DPS and the Reinhardt look to be on different pages at different times. So something to kind of keep an eye on. Rappel, on position could have been better. Some late rotates, got caught in poor open positions sometimes. Cooling usage was overall decent. Sometimes wish on crucial easy sleeps. Nothing crazy with Rappel, looked okay. Certainly not a superstar, but didn't play particularly poorly. His Baptiste weapon play was smooth. In other words, his his damage and heal balance was overall decent. We got a good mixture of shield pressure and healing on his team without compromising really either. Lamps were okay. Shifts are frequently wasted. The same problem with Shu, where before a fight even starts or right as a fight starts, we're using shift and nobody's taking damage. I'm not taking damage. You're not taking damage. There's no squishy that's getting benefit out of the shift. And because it is such a weak team heal and it's such a powerful self heal, this really, again, does open him up to Diva Lucio pressure or even just a McCree headshot from across the map. So, Rappel, please fix your shift usage. You're going to get punished for it later in fights. That's something that needs to be improved upon. Thank you for the sub. Fearless, good monkey with positioning and mechanics consistently. Ryan looked less impressive, but overall solid. Struggling to match team pressure timing windows. Now, I don't know who was leading the Dallas's dives, but if it was Fearless, really well done. The timing with his pressure on jumps consistently matched his DPS with very, very few exceptions. His mechanics were phenomenal. His positioning was good. Not a lot to ask for his monkey. Very, very few errors. Ryan was okay, looked solid, but again, it looked to be team-wide, that just wasn't as cohesive. So there was something that was missing there, and it wasn't definitely not as mechanically as impressive as his monkey. Jexy, decent mechanics on Brig, positional armor pack usage question marks. So in other words, a lot of times dropping from favorable positions for no apparent reason, standing out in the open, dying. For example, I believe he single-handedly threw Hanamura's second defense against, I believe it was the Justice. So big problems there. Too aggressively gets caught in grav. So very, very important that Brigs, even if they have rally, need to be tracking the enemy graviton when how they position, and that is something that Jexy was not consistently doing. Rally usage in general wasn't super good. And armor pack usage also not great. A lot of armor packs wasted on tanks or heroes that were not getting any value out of it, which meant that later in fights we were often getting our DPS and supports picked because we didn't have armor packs completely unnecessarily. So some armor pack discipline, certainly not near as good of a Brig as Skewed, but not exactly terrible. Beats, Mercy was terrible. I have nothing good to say about his Mercy whatsoever. Positioning, scouting, beam management, nothing. Just bad Mercy, to be perfectly honest. Beats were often too early in fights. Overall, his Lucio was mechanically solid, but the beat thing a little too early in fights. My team's not under a lot of pressure. we can't really push off of this beat advantage. There's, again, some communicational issues there that a lot of beats were just used and nothing happened, and I didn't like that whatsoever. But Lucio, in terms of mechanics, looks solid. Not sure what the reason why Fielder, who we're going to talk to in about just a second, was playing main support on some maps, but I do not like it, and I wish they would not do that. Fielder, fine flex support. Took a while to warm up, and Eichenwald, we only saw a little bit of his flex support, and it looked very bad at the start, but it warmed up quickly, and it looked okay at the end. Positioned a little too aggressively. But again, as mentioned earlier, why is he on Brig? Why is he on Lucio? There's some maps where he's playing Lucio, he's playing Brig, and you can just tell he's not comfortable in the heroes. He's not playing well. He's not anywhere close to as good as Jexy, who, even though isn't playing perfectly on Lucio and certainly not playing perfectly on Brig, he's inferior on both. So I'm not sure what the communicational or strategic eyesight thing is, but it's a bad look for Dallas. Last couple of things, more map specific. Hanamura, they forced Talon dives to the Reaper Sombra on Hana attack second for way too long. It's a way too open map. High grounds are way too important. That brawly of a short range comp just isn't going to work. They also look to prioritize main too much at Hanamura second. In other words, they like to rotate through main and not always clear high ground. I don't know if that was a double bubble dive or a very tricky situation there that they did it, but a couple times I was like, why are they doing that? So something to keep an eye on. Very goofy Winston Sigma Farah defense. So obviously Symmetra May is a very common composition to play an attack there, so you having a Farah or extra spam to prevent that from being viable for attack comps makes sense. But Winston Sigma Farah, not good at all. Very questionable, because it does beat some May, but it loses to everything else. It is weak to normal dive, is weak to double bubble, is weak to more Kree May brawl that have more poke. Your Winston is vulnerable, your Sigma is vulnerable, your Ana is vulnerable, especially when we're having Jexy on Mercy, which was not a strong point. Basically, I think they're very, very exposed to proper rotations from an enemy comp, whether that's Talon Dive, Winston, Sombra, Tracer, or just a normal double bubble with an Echo and a Tracer, an Echo and a Sombra. I think a team that's actually just like even competent at those compositions is going to completely roll that defense. Some questionable rotates from backline as well on that comp. So they're not as overall, they do not look comfortable in that comp, and I think that comp sucks. Havana, weak map for them because they have no hit scan. And not having a hit scan on Havana means that you're forced to play Brawl with a Doomfist when you don't have map control. So that was problematic on their attack specifically. They looked very lost in the Brawl attack and almost the entire map. Boston really took them to town. And it could have been even worse. Could have very easily have been a full hold on first if Boston had played it a little cleaner. The double shield defense versus Brawl on Dallas's defense also was not good. Specifically the tank positioning, way too many stacked tanks. Orisa Sigma stacked on top of each other, especially in first point. Not very experienced with how to like set up angles to bait Brawl and be able to spam Brawl out. Especially if you're playing a Genji Hanzo, you really need your tanks to be playing properly. Otherwise, you're just not going to get enough pressure on Brawl to actually get kills. Also, positioning play from tank line in general was kind of consistently a problem in terms of aggression. So Fearless was inting a little bit on a first on the Orisa. Might be a strong pick for him, but he did not look comfortable in the situation that he was put in. Ilios, not a whole lot to say. Mostly just question marks on why they were playing D.Va and Ilios. Ilios Lighthouse. There are strategies to play D.Va in terms to better leverage point pressure and to have better angles on your dive, but I don't think they're playing to the D.Va strengths very well. So I think that map, if they don't learn how to play the D.Va better in that situation, and or if they don't play Zarya, Ilios Lighthouse could be a problematic map for them in the future. So again, not trying to call individual players or coaches here. This is just giving information for either the team to use or for us to learn from. But overall, I think Dallas has a potential macro-wise to make a lot of improvements if they were a little bit more patient in their kill boxes, and if they work on their Brawl execution, I think this team could be very competent. I was very excited to see and happy to see the amount of team play that we saw from their dive. I think their dive looked very good when they were all on the same page. But obviously, the big red flag is are they going to get a hit scan player? Because that was a huge problem. Is if they'd simply had a good Tracer player, their dive would have been significantly better, even with the over-aggression and Jexy not looking great on Brig at all times. The big issue was Sparkle just was really struggling mechanically, and it was 5.5 versus 6 a great deal of the time. So some of that hopefully Dallas can resolve in the future, because overall this team has the potential to be an actually pretty solid team. Hope you find this interesting, and I'll see you in the next video.